Okay, good evening, everyone. On behalf of Understanding Ag and Soil Health Academy, we want to welcome you to this evening's webinar, Regenerative Gardening with Brian Downing. A few housekeeping items. Please keep your devices on mute so we don't pick up any background noise. If you have questions for Brian or any of the UA SHA team, please type them into the Q&A box. We will be answering them following the presentation. So Brian Downing and his wife Lane and their children live near Pleasant Garden, North Carolina. I've known Brian for a number of years. He's a former vocational agriculture instructor. He's an avid gardener and has livestock, doing direct marketing. He's a wealth of knowledge. So with that, Brian, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. As I understand it, there's folks from many different areas across the country. I'd like to thank you for joining us. Maybe I can pass on a little bit of my knowledge that I've learned the hard way to maybe save y'all from struggling in the same ways that I did. I'm trying to learn this. This is just my family. That's obviously me and my wife. Mace is the oldest one, and Madigan is the youngest one. A lot of what I do is for these three young ladies right here. And in the gardening side of things, with us consuming a lot of, or the majority of the products that we raise, this is why I bust my tail every single day. And as you probably do too, either as a grower or for your personal use. We have our own reasoning for what we do. A little bit about me. As Gabe said, I've known him for a pretty good while. I graduated from NC State University. I happened to squeeze 4 years into 5 while I was there. So I had a little bit of extra time to figure everything out. I got a Bachelor of Science in Animal Science. While I was working on my BS, I was working at a large dairy. We had multiple sites. The main site that I worked at was 1,800 milk cows in Liberty, which is just down the road from me. Started out as just a laborer. As I began to figure some stuff out on how the farm worked, and leaned on the herd manager to focus on the cow side, I stepped up and eventually my title was the assistant manager, which was a lot of headache, we'll put it that way. In the meantime, I noticed that I did not like the commercial industrial model. So I began looking for alternatives to the commercial system. And that's where I happened across Gabe in a YouTube video, just randomly one day. And I said, you know, that is what it is all about. Not because it was Gabe, not because of, you know, anything else, but that was how the system was designed. What he was talking about was how it was designed. So that's how I started managing my farm. We started producing grass-finished beef. I had already had beef cattle, and I just retained some calves that I already had. I wasn't feeding them grain anyway, so we just worked them into, you know, a grass-finished beef program. I'd had pigs before, got me some pigs, and we started doing pastured pork. And then I'd never done pastured poultry, so that was a little bit of a learning curve. And then obviously the produce, I just continued and expanded on that. Here lately, the last 2 or 3 years, one thing that has really given me the ability to do some of these regenerative practices that I'll touch on a little bit more tonight is my sawmill. Yes, I get to produce lumber that I can sell, to anybody. But the waste products of the sawmill for my operation, are just as valuable to the farm as the lumber is to the sawmill. So that's, how can I say that? That is stacking enterprises outside of agricultural enterprises. And we'll talk more about that shortly. I stole this quote. As Gabe said, I was a teacher. Teachers are very good at borrowing, we'll say, ideas. And Don Campbell, Gabe met him at a seminar somewhere, but this was my aha moment. If you want to make small changes, change the way you do things. Just do something different. If you want to make big changes, change the way you see things. Change the way you interpret things. Real quick, a little survey. Just on your own, take your little sheet of paper and jot down what you think the most important tool, be it a piece of equipment, tractor, whatever it may be, transplanter, you name it, that has the greatest impact on your operation. Just jot it down on a sheet of paper, and right below that, write down what you think the biggest limiting factor is. And as we go through this presentation, see if, those things start to change after you start to see some of the things that I'll be talking about. Starting off with the soil health principles. This is by far the single-handed thing that changed my farm. These 6 principles influenced not only me, but have influenced other people around me in a positive way, at least I would hope. They've changed my products. They've made them more nutrient dense. We can taste a difference in our own food. There's no price tag you can put on that. So these 6 principles, I have no doubt in my mind, they worked on my operation. I know they will work on your operation, as they will work anywhere in the country or anywhere in the world for that matter, where there's production agriculture. Starting off, what is your context? And what I mean by context, what makes you do what you do? What is the reasoning? I mean, is it just a job for you? Is it a hobby? Why do you do what you do? This is what context means to me. Why do you, the who, what, when, why, and where? These girls, this is my why. Because I know that I can raise a product that can keep them healthy without synthetics of any kind. We can't get that at the grocery store. So that's what I want to do. I want to provide for them something better than I was ever raised on. Your goals. Do you want to grow your operation? Are you a vegetable gardening operation that sells product? Or are you a backyard gardener that just wants to raise a few squash plants for yourself? Both of which are fine, but you have to understand where you're at and what you hold dear. The social aspect of context. Let me just go and tell you, I learned this one the hard way. I would walk in, I was all excited when I first got started. I'd walk into the store, coffee shop, whatever, and I'd start explaining to these farmers what I had found out. I had discovered something new, I thought. My little bubble got popped a bunch of times. From that'll never work to explicits that I can't say on this screen right now. The social pressures that you will feel for doing something different is beyond what you can ever imagine. Gabe's got a really diffusing quote. If you ever do get in an argument, just remember that everybody laughs at Gabe because he's different. Well, he gets to laugh at them because they're all the same. Stand out, go against the grain, be different. That's the only way we ever make progress. Emotional context and cultural context. This is more of the innate being of what makes you. If your operation is a direct reflection of you, how do you view the spiritual side? Are you just in it for a job? Let's make as much as we can. Or do you really want to have a connection with the landscape and be able to taste the food, taste the nutrient density, taste the soil? We were at a seminar. Dr. Alan Williams had provided supper that night, or Joyce Farms rather. And it was the best steak I have ever had in my life. Without a shadow of a doubt, the best steak ever. But I knew that their context of the production of that piece of meat was in line with mine. That was a very rewarding feeling, and also a very good steak. Soil armor, principle number 2. What is armor? Picture a glove. When you go out and you want to do something, say barbed wire, you want to pull some new fence, or maybe work in the metal shop a little bit, you put on gloves. Why? It's for protection. This is what armor is on the soil surface. Plant residues, amendments, be it wood chips or any other carbonaceous source. Excuse me. This skin helps with soil erosion, be it through water and runoff, as well as wind erosion. It keeps the soil particles in place. It is also a carbon source to directly feed biology and the microorganisms that make our farms and operations run. Once you get your armor applied to the soil surface, be it through mechanical termination or animals terminating a cover like this here, the armor helps reduce, especially in vegetable production, the splash or the soil splash up onto the base of these plants, which can mitigate a lot of plant diseases. This is just a small picture, clip it, of what that cover looked like before those stocker cattle grazed it. As you can see, I'm roughly 6 feet tall, and that's my daughter Mesa when she was much younger on my shoulders. But we're looking at 6.5 to 7 feet of, this was cereal rye, a mix of cereal rye. I grazed approximately 10 to 15% of it because my resource concern, to fit the context that I was trying to achieve, was to get armor on the soil surface. As you can see there, that residue is probably a solid 3 to 5 inches thick. That is what I wanted, as this little plot, maybe 3/10 of an acre, was going to go to sweet corn and would eventually go into pumpkins. All right, principle number 3. Excuse me. Principle number 3, least amount of disturbance possible. This one I also had to learn the hard way. Me and my father have had many arguments over tillage, which is one of the forms of disturbance through mechanical disturbance. Tillage has been around longer, or as long as production agriculture has been here, because they didn't have a way to plant seeds. They would go disturb the land, open it up, put the seeds in, so on and so forth. Well, now we have the technology and equipment to make these things happen with minimal disturbance. The reasoning behind this odd construction picture you would see here, a very good friend of mine sent me this, and this is a tillage machine. You wouldn't think it would have anything to do with agriculture. This machine here tills 36 to 40 inches deep. They use it for soil stability. It's used for roadbed construction, for building pads, so that they can reach the compaction levels that they need to get a CO and a pass off on the inspection. You wouldn't think that a backyard garden had anything to do with I'd hate to know how much this piece of equipment costs, but you wouldn't think a garden would have anything to do with it, as far as, compaction. These pieces of equipment do the exact same thing. And as a young farmer, when I was first getting started, this is what I was told I needed. You fluff that ground up, or you fluff that dirt up, everything is loosened up, it can breathe. Yeah, until you get your first rainfall event. And then you've got a brick, and you have no water infiltration. And then you just have additional negative compounding and cascading effects. All tillage destroys soil structure, decreases water infiltration rates, reduces soil carbon, and it also reduces overall farm profits. Why would we want to do that? Second type of disturbance, chemical disturbance. I don't know how everybody else's operations are, but I was always told 10-10-10 was the fertilizer you needed to get for your garden. 10-10-10. It works for everything. Well, till I found regenerative agriculture. Synthetic fertility, is generally in the form of some kind of salt. These salts, as you apply them to the soil surface, can have a very negative impact on the soil, much less can have damages to the plants you are trying to actually grow through burn, or if you don't irrigate like me, if you don't get the water, it will actually wilt your plants and can kill them, obviously. Earthworm kills through the salts. You dehydrate the salts, you mess up the balance of the concentration gradients in the soil, you pull moisture out of the biology to decrease the salt concentration, and you get huge negative ramifications of that. I'm not 100% on all the fungal bacterial relationship challenges. That would definitely be some of the more advanced folks. I just know that mycorrhizal fungi and some of your other populations in the soil that are critical for normal maintenance of a plant, chemicals can have, especially fertilizers and things like that, can have negative impacts on those relationships between the mycorrhizal and the plant itself. Pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides, the other stuff. They're very good at what they do. I'm assuming that everyone knows pesticide, what the definition of that. They're extremely good at what they do. They are good at killing plants. They are good at killing bugs, and they are good at killing diseases. But they have astronomical negative compounding and cascading effects that we may not see for years. These are my tools. This is all I have. I got a little tractor. This is a no-till corn planter. I was planting sweet corn before I had this. I planted 3 acres of sweet corn with a tomato stake. I was no-till, but I planted it with a tomato stake. Walk, poke a hole in the ground, drop a seed. Step on it, poke a hole, drop a seed. My time ain't worth a whole lot, but it's worth more than that. So I broke down and bought me a fabricated piece of equipment. This may be a corn planter, but it also plants watermelons and pumpkins and squash and zucchini and you name it. Right here, I will take a piece of PVC pipe and run down between the opening wheels, right in front of the closing wheels there. And if I can get that seed to fall into that furrow, I can plant it, and it doesn't have to go through the meter on the actual planter. This allows me to plant okra. I've planted okra with this. I've planted radishes and beets. You just control your depth. Transplanter for tomatoes and other transplanted crops, broccolis and cabbages and stuff like that. This is just a simple tree spade. Excuse me. A simple tree spade. I pick these up at any Tractor Supply. It's as little of disturbance as I have found to find. As I have been able to find. I can plant 75 to 80 tomatoes an hour with this tool right here. It's justifiably, to me, just as cost effective to do this as to hire people to plant for me. I can fly through it, and then I can also plant how I want it planted and not have to put my trust in someone else to accurately plant my crops. Principle number 4, diversity. This is probably the easiest in a gardening setting or environment because of short growing seasons. It's not like we're waiting 120 days on corn. I can have sweet corn in 75 days. I can have, radishes in 30 days. I can have squash in 40 days. We can diversify the very plots that we're planting to increase the amount of plant roots and root exudates that the soil sees in any given growing season. This short growing season is scalable. You can do it in buckets or raised beds. You can do it in a small backyard garden, or you can do it to scale on a production type setting. And with this, these short growing seasons and the ability to be in and out of an area very quickly, it allows me to interseed a companion or cover crop under these cash crops. What I mean by that, if I'm planting, let's say sweet corn, I'm never going to plant just corn. I'll let the corn get up, 30 days, and then I'll go back and broadcast a iron and clay cowpea into that at 5 to 8 pounds to the acre. It doesn't seem like it's going to do a whole lot. But when you create a relationship between two plants, you get a synergy that you cannot measure. The corn is cycling phosphorus for the legume and the peas, while the peas are cycling nitrogen for the corn. You can't measure that, nor can you put a value on it, or at least I can't. Another mix that you can do is in between, or that I do, is between squash or zucchini, some of the concurrent vegetables, wide row spacing stuff. I will plant buckwheat in between the rows. I plant my squash on 6-foot centers. So in between those rows in a 3 to 4 foot band, I'll just broadcast or sprinkle out some buckwheat at maybe 2 to 3 pounds a cubic yard. I want it fairly thick. Not only does that help cycle phosphorus, that in 30 days or 35 days will be a pollination strip inter-row or inter-row. That's combining multiple entities into one production setting. And I now have multiple roots, I have multiple plants, and I have multiple relationships. That's what I'm after. I want to compound as much as I possibly can in a given period of time. Integrated pest management. When you have multiple species, you're obviously going to have some plants that the pests want to go to. It's the same old adage of putting marigolds around around your garden. You can play with this. I've planted a lot of mixed covers and blended covers, and I've noticed that where I have my grazing mixes for my cattle and my hogs, I've realized that in those mixes, because of the way I design them, most of my sugar aphids go towards that mix, drawing them away from my cash crops and my vegetables, which is a good thing. And again, you get more nutrient cycling by having more roots in the system, creating those relationships, and it cycles not only nutrients, rather, it cycles carbon, and that's what we're after. This was at a good friend of mine. This is not my operation. This is at a good friend of mine's house. To scale, this is just 3 raised beds. They're 8 by 8 maybe. This is a 5-way blend of cereal rye, hairy vetch, crimson clover, turnips, and oh gosh, what else? I can't remember. It doesn't matter. It's a 5-way blend cover crop on November the 2nd. On January the 17th, we've been fairly cold, but you can see how this blend has really started cycling carbon, has really started growing. What he actually said he was going to do, he's going to fence this off with some portable fencing and graze his sheep right here in his raised beds, cycling that carbon even faster and more efficiently through a ruminant instead of just mowing it or clipping it, however you choose to do so. These are some other creative means of raised beds. On the left here, you've got some old tires, anything that would hold the soil or hold a growing medium. I personally, here in the Southeast, I wouldn't use black just because we get so hot. When the sun is blaring down, it's 102 in July and August. I would have to either paint them or do something different. I've tried black plastic and all sorts of stuff for raised beds and containment gardens, and I've never had much success with black items. Here is Ray standing next to some old feed troughs or gutters that have just been, we got lettuces or something in them. You can see some armor here, mulch, some folks may call it, protecting that soil and holding the moisture and feeding biology, even though that is not, or that is up off the ground and raised, if that soil just was picked up off the ground, there's still plenty of biology in that system that can fuel the growth of those plants. Here is a cover crop blend on my operation. This is cereal rye, about 40 pounds of cereal rye, hairy vetch, crimson clover, Austrian winter pea, and just a touch of turnip. This is a go-to mix for me. This is versatile. I can plant anything from sweet corn to pumpkins to squash, tomatoes, any broccoli, anything I want to works well in this mix. If I had to criticize this right here, I would say I'm a little heavy on legume in this particular area. I'd like to see a little more grass there. As far as terminating this, I would personally terminate this with the cattle through adaptive grazing practices, giving them a really small area so that we get a lot of hoof impact, and then we get the manure distribution as added fertility. You can also, I don't have one, but a roller crimper. There's several companies out there that make one, I&J, and you can make one maybe $200 for a small scale crimper. I have a good friend of mine that made one and it works perfectly. He's got $200 in it. Hour and a half in the welding shop. Not that big a deal. But you've got to get this stuff to the ground. When you're ready to terminate it, it's got to be on the ground or you're going to struggle. I've learned that on multiple occasions. Some of the things, a little more detail of some of the covers I've found that work best for me. Never plant a single species. If you're going to plant one, you might as well plant two. And if you're going to plant two, you might as well plant 5. Yes, there is a law of diminishing returns, but try to mix as many different strata between cool season grasses, cool season broadleaves, whatever season you're going into, warm season grasses and warm season broadleaves. The more of these species that you can intertwine together, the more, like we said earlier, the more relationships that your soil is going to be building. Also, in deciding on what you're going to be planting as far as a cover crop, what are you trying to accomplish with that cover? What is your resource concern? How do you plan on using that to improve your operation? Some simple species that work well here in the Southeast for me. Nothing fancy. Don't really pay attention to the species. Just realize that wherever you're at in the country or in the world even, something will work in all 4 seasons. Maybe depending on the cold. I don't know. We don't get all that cold. But there's something in all 4 categories that will work on your operation at some point or another. Those are just something that happen to be a few of the ones that I use and that I've had significant success with. Pollinator strips. Everybody wants to talk about the plight of the bees. It exists. Through my 5 or 6 years of regenerative ag here, I have noticed a significant return on my operation of honeybees and bumblebees. There's a gentleman right up the road from me who also raises vegetables. He rented either 8 or 10 hives, and they all left his operation and came to mine. I don't know if he's watching tonight. I'm not going to mention any names, but all his bees came to my place. I don't use any synthetic pesticides or any synthetics, period, but I have nothing to contaminate their food source. So these pollinator strips, you've got to, it's like the Kevin Costner movie, Field of Dreams, build it and they will come. Give them a place to live and they'll show up. It may take them a year or two, but they'll get there. And it can also provide some additional income. Honey, apiary relationships, that can also develop some marketing tools for you, or it can just give you a better crop through a better and more successful pollination season. As I said earlier, these pollination strips can be incorporated around the edges of fields or right down the middle between the rows. I've had great success with both. Whatever you can use, whatever you can do to maximize the space that you have in your operation. If it's a 20 by 20 backyard garden, if it's a 5-gallon bucket, or if it's a 50-acre field, maximize the space and utilize everything that you possibly can. Bring back the bugs. Insects are a massive part of biology, huge. Obviously, bees are essential. Like I said, provide the habitat and they will come. And if you just take a second to step back and watch, I know this picture isn't very clear. We had already frozen multiple times, probably half a dozen, maybe a dozen times when that picture was taken. If I could have had a decent video, there was probably 200 bees on this very plant. This is one plant flowering in mid to late October. So we can provide a food source and a space as our soils begin to become healthy or more healthier. We can provide space for biology longer, which through the relationships that it has with not only the plant but the soil, we can further improve our soil health across more days of the year. Principle number 5, living root in the soil as long as possible. Keep a living root in the ground. It's critical. It is absolutely critical. It's much easier to do in the Southeast than it would be, say, in Bismarck, North Dakota. But it is essential to keep the photosynthetic cycle going as many days of the year as you possibly can. Plants are the largest solar panel in the world. There's been this huge push for solar energy here lately. Plants have been doing it since the beginning of time. They know, obviously, they've got the most practice. We're trying as farmers to put as much carbon in the soil surface or on the soil surface and into the soil as we possibly can. This little diagram right here, it shows you the relationship between above ground biomass and below ground biomass. It is astonishing how shallow we think plants are. I was watching a thing the other night. It was in South Dakota or Colorado. They were talking about battling leafy spurge with goats. We don't have leafy spurge in Randolph County, North Carolina, so I didn't know anything about it. Leafy spurge is an invasive weed, we'll call it. Well, yeah, invasive weed. With a taproot or a rooting depth of up to 14 to 15 feet. If a plant is going to work that hard to survive, why not let it? Because I love Dr. Williams's definition of a weed. First off, define one. But if a plant grazed by livestock provides nutrition It's not a weed, it's a forage. So therefore, we can't objectively define a weed. So if this leafy spurge is or can grow when nothing else can, let it proliferate, because weeds, what we define as weeds, are nature's managers of our mismanagement. What we have messed up, nature knows how to take care of, we just won't let her. We feel like we have to go kill it. Nature's just trying to put a scab on a wound by popping up weeds. Plants and these extensive root systems also help with nutrient cycling and building soil structure, soil aggregation. My favorite. I milk 1,800 cows 3 times a day. I like some cows. Animal integration. Think back through the eons of time that you can, history books and all that. Where do you find in nature animalists? Maybe on the extremes, but there's still, polar bears and seals and all of that. There is animals in every ecosystem. And this is the only way to take soil health to the next level. They cycle nutrients much more efficiently. Their excrement aids in the proliferation of biology in the soil. And they, especially ruminants, I'll focus on ruminants, they reset the solar collection ability of a plant. You get some root sloughage, and then the plant regrows by attracting biology. So this animal integration is critical as long as it's managed correctly. Earlier I said we'll terminate crops through adaptive grazing. If you continuously graze, it can be just as destructive as tillage. Just as destructive as tillage. Notice there I've got some uses of cattle. Cattle are a tool, sheep are a tool, goats are a tool, pigs are a tool, any chickens, poultry, turkeys, you name it. They're all tools that can be used strategically to impact an environment. Like I said, I use my cattle for mostly crop termination and increasing soil armor, nutrient cycling, fertility, and it also provides me some additional farm income. One thing I like about the protein side of things, and it took me a little while to figure this out, cattle, or we'll say proteins, they're more nutrient dense, and I'm not meaning nutrient dense by, they've got more iron than a squash. Produce is 80 to 90% water. So through nutrient density of not only a higher quality product, but a more, I don't want to word that, a more complete product. Now, the West wasn't one on milk and sour cream. They had dehydrated beef, bison, and all of that. It was very nutrient dense. They weren't hauling around a bunch of water. So that's one of the reasons why I've started to focus a little more on the livestock. Because I know I can build soil health much faster, which will only increase my produce and garden productivity. This is a little collage of a few little entities I've got stirring. I had a sow and I rented a boar. I no longer farrowed. This was 3 or 4, 5 years ago. We obviously had her out on some pasture, and she had plenty of piglets. So we got in the pig business pretty quick. As you can look on the right there, the cattle, you can kind of see where the rye was. They were, like I said, that was probably 3/10 of an acre. They spent, those are 900 pound calves, right before they were being bred. They were on that area for about a day through 3 moves so that I could get the most intense hoof action to trample that, as well as the manure and urine. Here's some piglets that they're not piglets anymore, that we're currently raising. I don't put my pigs on pasture until the vegetation can regrow through their disturbance. But they are on a heavy carbon-based bedding pack, which helps absorb those nutrients that they excrete. And here's Doodlebug, her and her broilers. We had fun with these. These birds actually went right back into our freezer. So how rewarding is it to not only get to spend that time with your children, but to be able to put food on your table that you know exactly where it came from, exactly what's in it, as well as utilizing the feces and the urine that they left on the soil to grow another animal on the same piece of land. Carbon is king. There's no way around it. This is probably the most important part of my entire operation. While the cattle are, once I rotationally graze through the entire farm, I'll bring the cattle to about a 2 or 3 acre piece up on top of the knoll. It's nice and semi-dry. When you get 70 inches of rain, it's kind of hard to keep anything dry. But cattle are up here. They're in just a stick-built shed. I didn't have the money to go buy 6x6s, so I went and cut down oak trees. Function over form works for me. It may not work for you. You may have to have a perfect shed. That's okay. That's all in your context. But this shed right here, I had the sawmill. I cut my own lumber. It's a 24 by 36. I've got $1,200 in it. It works. I mean, yeah, you see they've worked on it pretty good. But by feeding the hay, which I've only fed hay for like 90 days, which is much less than when I was conventionally raising cattle. I've shortened the amount of time I was feeding hay, which is in addition more profitable. But all the manure and all the urine is captured right there in the barn. The sawdust, as you can see on the bottom picture, it is the carbon source and is the checking account, quote unquote, on my operation. It is the diaper that I put under the cows to capture the nutrients that fall out the hind end. I don't want them to vaporize, nor do I want them to wash to the creek. So I want to put something under the cow that's going to catch and hold those nutrients. That's where the waste product of the sawmill comes from. I've also got a chipper that I can chip up some of the waste if I need some bigger sources of carbon. Again, captures and holds. This usable product, this compost, is the lifesaver, or was the lifesaver on my operation. And if you would like wood chips or need sources of carbon in your area, call local tree companies. A lot of times they will just bring it by and dump it at your place. What kind of opportunity could that be? They're bringing you a way to heal your land for free. They're just looking for, it's a waste to them. So use that waste product to not only improve your land and your operation, but then be able to show other people how to do the same thing, much like the privilege I have of talking to y'all tonight. Notice on the left, I have current carbon is the backbone of my operation. That is a very dear statement to myself. I love that statement because most current agricultural models are dependent on ancient sunlight. I want to be using sunlight from, let's just say, the last 10 years, trees, leaves, any kind of wood, hay, grass, any kind of biological material that can rot is what I want on my farm. I don't make any hay on my farm. I want to keep all of the carbon in the soil. I will bring hay from off farm. I'll buy my hay and bring those nutrients to my farm instead of moving nutrients around my farm. Here's just a quick picture of the compost that comes out of the cattle. That is approximately 18 months old. What I'll do, I'll continually build that bedding pack, and then I'll turn pigs in it. And if you look real close, they've got a plow on the end of their head, and they fluff it up, and that's the product I get. I've got a gentleman right the road from me that's got some greenhouses. He will actually purchase this, excuse me, by the tractor bucket load to stretch his potting soil and purchased seeding soils for his greenhouse plants. It's much cheaper for him, and it works, and it actually has nutrients in it. A lot of the potting soils that he has or that he gets for his seed starting materials, they don't have any nutrients in them. He has to apply all these nutrients. These this compost has plenty of nutrients already plant available. Microsites. I absolutely love this microsite idea, or farming by the square foot. Think of your operation. Just close your eyes and think of your operation and look for dead zones, corners of fences, south-facing walls that get another 3 or 4 hours of sunlight. The gutters on a building, how can I capture, that water to run a certain direction? I know y'all couldn't see that, sorry. Fence lines. How can you utilize infrastructure already available to be additionally used? This is a little 20 by 20 corner right here. Funny story. You see, I've got the sling on there. I planted about 125 cabbage plants right there. And as you can see, I'm getting them started. The day before this picture was taken, I was doing the exact same thing. And I'd been working entirely too hard and too long. And I literally passed out and fell over and separated my left shoulder. And here I am the next day. I don't know if you call that stupidity or dedication, but here I am back out there making sure my cabbage plants are taken care of. That little 400 square foot right there made me those cabbage plants. I didn't do anything to them except a little bit later put a touch of compost around them. 90 days, 60 to 90 days, that little 400 square foot patch made me $1.25 a square foot. Extrapolate those numbers and you start getting into a salary that could potentially, change your life. As you can see right here, This is a previous picture. That's a woven wire fence, 360, 380 feet long, 6-inch squares. All the math's already done for me. Plant a cucumber every foot or plant a green bean every foot. Those trellising plants will run up the fence. You don't have to bend over to pick. And I can pick 80 to 90 bushels of green beans in a growing season off that little stretch of fence that would otherwise be standing there holding the earth together. Utilize these areas and explore how you can further your productivity. Now that we've grown everything, now we've either got to get rid of it or eat it. And I like being able to sell it personally. So direct marketing. This can be the bottleneck for a lot of operators. I don't know if you can tell, I'm from the South. I sort of like sweet tea and talking quite a bit. So I don't have any trouble talking to folks. So with that being said, I like people to talk about my products. That's why I only use word of mouth advertising. I've never paid for an ad. I've never put up a sign, any of that. And the reason why I like word of mouth advertising, you never make forward progress with a negative experience. Think about that. How many times you went and got a bad cheeseburger and told your buddy to go get one? You're not going to. So you're always dependent, we'll say, on your product to speak for itself. That leads into, regeneratively grown products are different. They're more nutrient dense. They're going to taste better. So they need to be marketed as such and not just sold on the commodity market. I do sell a lot at farmers markets when I don't have, or when I have excess. The general public wants to know where their food is coming from. Some frequently asked questions. I get a bunch of random questions at the farmers market. I usually go to the one in Greensboro. It's about 20 minutes north of me. It's not generally what you would think. I get a lot of, where are you from? I'm from Asheboro. Well, not a whole lot of people know that. So you say, I'm 30 minutes away. And they say, oh, okay. Do you use pesticides, herbicides, chemicals, any of that? No, ma'am. No, sir. I use some farm-created fertility through the use of some cattle and some hogs that I have. That perks their attention. Well, generally, they'll either buy whatever they're wanting or they'll move along. But then they come back and then they buy something. And then they say, well, what else do you have? And that's when you get to really share, your story. I've got tomatoes, I've got squash, I've got cucumbers, I've got okra, I've got decorative Indian corn. I've got 3 acres of wild blackberries that I originally thought about spraying until I decided I can sell $3,000 worth of blackberries a year. All I've got to do is figure out how to pick them. I've got broccoli, I've got Boston buck pork roast, I've got watermelon, I've got sweet corn, I've got spinach. What can I do for you? And that gets their attention. Well, the next question, why should I buy your product versus the man or woman down the road? And this is the question you've been waiting on the entire conversation, because then you get to sit down and explain your story and how you grow your products. Or you get to share on a personal level why. You get to share your context. What made you do this? Why are you doing it? How are you doing it? All of this, and you get to create a relationship, and that's what creates customers. Building a relationship with your customers is the hardest thing to do, because they want a quality product, but they've got to be able to trust you. And that's all they want to be able to do. They want to trust the person that is providing their next meal. So think back to that survey as we start to wrap things up a little bit. Think back to that survey. What do you think is the most important tool that will have the greatest impact on your operation? It may be, infinite number of things. And what was the biggest limiting factor? When I first started down this path of regenerative agriculture, I thought it was a piece of equipment. And I thought it was, I need 80 cows instead of 20. I thought it was something I could do or I needed to buy, but that wasn't the case. My eyes were the greatest tool that I had at my disposal. Observation is critical in understanding how your farm operates regeneratively. If you treat it like a chemistry set and all you've got to do is plug and play and drop back and forth and change a few patterns, you don't have to understand anything. But when you step back and let nature handle your operation, it will amaze you at the relationships and synergistic opportunities that will come to life on your farm. And your brain is your biggest setback or holdup. We get in our own way. We are our own worst enemy. Our imagination is the only thing holding us back from making the next big move to not only change possibly the profitability of our operation, but change the future of our operation. Just remember, we don't inherit, or our children, excuse me, I messed that up. Our children do not inherit our operations from us. We borrow them from our children. How do you want to leave it? And don't let your mind get in the way of taking the step. Thank you for joining us tonight. I appreciate it. And I think we're going to open it up to a few questions.
Right. Thank you, Brian.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. We have questions coming in, and as usual, we're going to allow questions not only on this presentation, but we have many from the Understanding Ag team ready and willing and able to answer questions. So I will start it off here. First question I'm going to direct towards Shane. And the question is, where do you start in landscaping a new lot? And they're talking about a home lot, Shane.
Where do you start? Well, if it's brand new construction, most times the backfill is, not very healthy soil at all. So if that's what you're dealing with, the first thing is start, as Brian talked in his presentation, get cover on that soil. So if you're landscaping, near your house, you sure might consider utilizing wood chips. Start building back some of that soil biology back within your soil. Planting, early successional plants within those flower beds. Daylilies are a great plant to utilize for that purpose. If you're starting to put your yard areas in and you're doing seeding activities, make sure you do a really good job mulching it. You understand you might have to do that once or twice in order to get the stand you want, but that is a good way, get that carbon cover on top of the soil, start protecting it, as Brian acknowledged there in his presentation. But, it's going to take just a little bit of time to build the microbiology up in order to get a healthy stand if you're seeding the yard. So those are some things to think about. But the primary thing is get some sort of cover, get a living root in the soil, and a diversity of plants, be useful too.
Follow those principles that Brian talked about. Brian, did you have anything to add to that?
If that was a great response, Shane. If I had to maybe add anything to that, would be just follow, or not even add to it, just reiterate, follow those principles and apply them because they are going to work. We didn't destroy the soils overnight. We're not going to regenerate them overnight, but we can regenerate them much faster than we once thought possible. So just follow the principles and don't get discouraged because it's always darkest right before dawn.
Thank you, Brian. Next question is from Tanya, and Ellen, I'm going to direct this question to you. Tanya asks how to manage buffalo flies without insecticides. Alan?
Okay, very good question. You know, what it all boils down to, there's multiple ways that you can manage any type of internal and external parasite. And as a matter of fact, if you'll go on our understandingag.com website under our resources tab and from the experts, you'll find a article that I wrote there titled 6 Steps or 6 Ways to Control Internal and External Parasites. And I believe the foretitle to it is Don't Let Things Bug You. But that covers various strategies that you can use. But I'll give you a few here tonight. Bottom line is that you want to be able to have biology fighting biology. And so a handful of strategies are, number one, keep your animals moving forward rapidly. That allows you to keep them moving away from new hatches. And it allows you to be able to get a measure of protection from various types of flies, flace flies, buffalo flies, you know, horse flies, so on and so forth. The other strategy is to utilize multiple species of livestock. When you have flies that lay eggs in manure pats, you want those manure pats disturbed and broken up pretty quickly. So if you have other species such as chickens and pigs and that type of thing that'll root through those manure pats, then that'll destroy those fly eggs and larvae before they can become flies and become a problem. Dung beetles, managing so that you have a lot of dung beetles that can rapidly disintegrate your manure pats as well helps quite a bit. And then also genetic selection. There is natural resistance in animals. And so you can genetically select for animals that have a lot more resistance to virtually any internal and external parasite. Now to do this though, you've got to stop the mass treatment of those animals in your herd or in your flock so that you can identify those that have more resistance and those that are more susceptible, and obviously cull the ones that are more susceptible and keep breeding stock out of those that show far less pest pressure.
Great, Alan. Thank you. Next question, I'm going to direct towards David Kleinschmidt. David, here is the question. How do you improve soil that is high pH, high in clay content, low rainfall area, the irrigated water is high in salt? Boy, that's some tough soils there, David.
Sounds like it. You know, if we're just to look at the soils first, you know, we kind of have to address why do we have some high pH issues and what are some of the damaging effects of high pH as well. You know, if it's just high calcium, you know, is it due to excessive liming, or is it just due to the, you know, the parent material of that soil too? Or is it due to, depending on what the pH is it due to excessive sodium that could be in that soil profile? If it's just high calcium, you know, if we're looking at anywhere from a high 7 and an 8, you know, there's different things that we could do as far as like on a chemistry side, we could be applying maybe gypsum or ammonium sulfate, elemental sulfur, even ammonium. But to go and look at this as a biological system, using a cover crop such as barley that can handle some of those higher pHs, and like Brian was talking about, laying that armor on that soil surface and keeping it covered. As that armor breaks down, you're going to actually be releasing CO2 and carbonic acids, which are going to help to dissipate out some of those high pHs in that environment as well. When you look at the salts in the irrigation water, that's another challenge, because you're just going to continue to increase your pH and cause some sodic issues there. So the biggest thing would be, when we're managing our irrigation, is to do very light and frequent irrigations. But if we're looking at this like on a garden type situation, which a lot of gardens are very, our vegetables are very susceptible to salt damage, would be to, if we're looking at like an overhead sprinkler system as an irrigation, to maybe put some type of a drag line on each drop. So we're just putting the water on the soil surface and not actually hitting the plants. That'd be about the only way to manage the water issue there.
Very good. Does somebody else have something to add? Okay, Brian, this one is for you. Andrew would like you to elaborate on using animals for cover crop termination. He wants to know, do you do multiple grazes or a single graze?
Great question. Let me clarify a little more on that. I only use my cattle for crop termination. I obviously use their hoof action, but I only graze it one time, but I control the amount of live weight per acre. Now, granted, on a smaller herd size, I've only got 18 or 19 head. I have to adjust that to ratios of an acre. Like I was in some of the pictures there in the slides, they were on 3/10 of an acre. Well, I would put, just to say 20 head at 18 or 800 pounds. That's 160,000 pounds per acre of live weight, but they were only on 1/10 of an acre. So you can magnify the amount of hoof impact and trauma, we'll call it, to a certain piece of ground. And once they terminate that cover, I don't go back and use any sort of other terminating methods. I don't run hogs or chickens. I'll leave it and then I'll plant straight into it.
Thank you, Brian. I would just add to that, be careful and realize that in order for a cover crop to be terminated by grazing, that cover crop needs to be in anthesis, in other words, the reproductive state. If you graze it earlier than that, it will regrow. So grazing is definitely one tool for termination. Other tools are such as Brian described, a crop roller can be used. We would much rather see you use something like that as compared to tillage. Shane, I'm going to direct the next question to you. This question is, how do you gauge nutrient density?
How do you gauge nutrient density within your food products, I'm assuming? If that's what you're gauging it, it's going to be the flavonoids, that are expressed in that fruit or vegetables that you're consuming, or even the proteins you're consuming. These phytochemicals that are being created, through the soil health, in unison with the microbiology, that are able to help, get the micronutrients into those plants that they need to help build, these flavonoids, these biomolecules within the flavor compounds.
Thank you, Shane. And they were specifically asking, how do you gauge that, measure that?
You can
One
use
of
a
the quick
refractometer.
ways, exactly. Shane, do you want to explain that a little bit, please?
Yeah, I mean, most people aren't familiar with a refractometer. It's a tool, device that you can take sap and put on there, and you look at a scale, you hold it up to the sun, and basically it measures the sugar component and also a lot of other components inside that sap. And you can measure on that scale. The higher it measures on the scale, the more sugar component it does have.
Yeah.
That's a tool we use often, and the same as many on this panel use every day.
And we do offer those refractometers on our Understanding Ag website. Shane, as long as I got you on, here's a good question. I'm going to ask you and then have Brian add in. Kelvin is wondering, is wood ash from our wood stove of any value in our garden?
Absolutely. It's got a lot of mineral component. We spread it out on ours quite often. Even the char itself, it's a great habitat for the microbiology. It's a carbon. It holds onto a lot of soluble nutrients. The biggest thing I would caution, if you're using a lot of char, the best thing to do with it is get it behind livestock. You want to have that char, basically charged with soluble nutrients, because it's going to pull nutrients away if you just add it to the soil as an amendment without being charged. So, I'm sure Brian does this also. Get it behind the animals, let the animals manure and urine on it, and kind of mix it up with some bedding material. Makes a fascinating product to put in your gardens.
Just like Brian showed he's doing with his wood chips. Correct, Brian?
Yes, sir. It's funny that question was asked. I actually cleaned Mom and Dad's stove out today and took the ash and put in the bedding pack to mix in with the carbonaceous material, manure and urine, so that later or further on down the road in the spring, when I do apply that, those nutrients will already be incorporated into the bedding pack and thus spread more evenly.
Great. Alan, here's a question for you. Magdalena asks, how do you avoid pathogenic bacteria such as E. coli from proliferating in the sawdust or manure pack?
Well, obviously one of the things is that if you have cattle or any livestock that are raised regeneratively on pasture, you're going to have far less pathogens to begin with. So that's one thing we really need to realize, and that's been proven over and over through detailed analysis. But the second is that when you put that through a heat and a composting type situation, then you're going to take care of any potential pathogens that might be there as well. So it's really a pretty simple process, and it's not something that you have to worry about. The truth is, and Gabe, Brian, y'all both know this, that these types of things, animal manures and so forth, and bed and pack have been used for a very long time for helping to add fertility to gardens.
Yep. Very good. Thank you, Alan. Brian, Kathleen asks, what are your companion plants with sweet corn?
Okay, great question, because I love my sweet corn. That is a huge seller for me, and I'll focus on it more so than I will my other crops. Sweet corn, right here in the Southeast, we get pretty hot. June, July, and August, we can get upper 90s, pushing into the hundreds. So I'm going to go with a warm season legume, a cowpea. I don't like alfalfa. It's too expensive. You can use soybeans. I was talking with another one of the Soil Health Academy participants, Russell Hedrick, a few years back, and he said there was some research with soybean that showed some allelopathy between corn and soybean. So I choose not to use soybean, but I'll use cowpeas. You could go as far as some sun hemp, whatever, a warm season or a legume that would mix well or blend well with your environment.
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna call on several of the Understanding Ag staff for this one because it's been asked a number of times. So Doug Peterson, maybe I'll start with you and then others can join in. We have several people asking, how can you plant garden vegetables into a stand of alfalfa and grass? I saved the easy one for you, Doug.
Yeah. You know, there's a lot of different ways to do it. Some things that we have done, you know, it depends on your scale, obviously, how big of an area. If you're just talking about a small garden, we've used cardboard as a way to terminate those any kind of perennial grasses. You know, I sure wouldn't use any method of tillage to chop it up. So something to kill it, something to set it back without spraying it or without tilling it, leaves some type of cover. I've seen some people use plastic, you know, and that it will kill it, but boy, if you've ever seen some soil underneath that plastic, because of the limitation, it prevents water. Basically it sterilizes it. It doesn't kill the grass, it sterilizes everything. So cardboard would be a good choice if you're talking about a garden sized area. It's going to be really pretty tough to do it on a large scale if you're talking about a whole field.
Brian, anything to add to that?
We don't have very good soils conducive for alfalfa.
If I may then, Brian, I'll just add,
Yeah,
I
please.
have done this, and what I've used is actually the landscape fabric, the tree fabric, to lay that down. That's approximately 3 feet wide. And then I use it for multiple years. You know, I just leave it in there and poke my holes for my transplants or the seed. And that works very well. And the only thing, if you have a rhizomatous grass plant, eventually that will come and poke up the hole through the holes you made. But that works really well, Art. So those of you who asked that question. Moving on here. Let's see. Here we have the question. And Doug, I'm going to start with you on this one. Do you have any thoughts on working with forested land, such as how do you efficiently undercrop and thin the forest for sunlight? So I'm assuming they want to know about how do you thin so you can get crops started in that understory.
So you bet. You know, to get some kind of an understory growing in there, you're going to have to get that canopy down to, you know, it's going to depend on what exactly you're trying to grow under there, but you're going to have to get it to a 30 or 40% canopy cover, and that takes quite a bit of removal. What I prefer, or what I like to do, or recommend to do is take out whatever logs you can, and then Brian had mentioned he had a wood chipper. Leave as much of that carbon from those trees in there as you can. You know, that's one of the problems when people clear forests is our soils, our whole soil production system is a carbon-based system. In our grass systems, that carbon is in the soil. In a forest system, then the carbon is generally above the soil in those trees. So if we remove all of those trees and either slash and burn or chop them all and haul them all off, then we don't leave any carbon in that system. And so leaving to take out what canopy you need to get the species you want to grow. Generally, if that's some type of a civil pasture system, you're gonna have to get down to 20 to 30% cover, aerial cover at the most, to let enough sunlight to come in. Start out with your junk species. Leave your crop trees there. Leave the species that you want to proliferate, the mast species, the hardwood. Start with your junk stuff first, and get that out of there to get that canopy down to that 20-30%. We have some areas that are kind of a savanna, and that's what they are. They're a big oak tree, and they're these huge big wolf trees they're not straight and tall. They're huge and they spraddle out. And a lot of forests, if you go in and look at the forests today, you'll find those big wolf trees scattered out through that forest. And then all these other small secondary trees are coming up around everything. And so that a lot of times that will kind of give you an indication of where you need to be on that that stand thickness. And generally those areas, once you start thinning them out, the native plants that are in there will come back. I've seen many circumstances where a wildfire went through a solid wooded area, and it totally defoliated all the trees. It didn't kill them, but it defoliated them. And one in particular that I recall, it was a solid oak forest, blackjack oaks in South Missouri. The fire went through it, defoliated everything in the middle of May, and by July, that was the most solid stand of native big blue stem that you ever saw. And
wow.
So,
Thank you, Doug. Brian, anything to add?
I'm not, like I said, I've got a sawmill. I'm not in the timber management business per se. But one thing that popped into my head, if the timber's not right now ready to be thinned, depending on what sort of scale you were on, you could look at maybe trying to do some mushrooms in the shaded areas, and just utilize the shade while you've got it. Or if you're needing to thin the timber, then like Doug said, take enough to make a difference, but don't take enough to make damage.
Yep, very good. So there's several on the call who could answer this question. It's from Paul, and Paul asked this. He said, I see more local food production and direct marketing enterprises popping up due to COVID. But is there a chance too much supply and competition with all of these new producers? Shane, do you want to start that one? Are you worried about the competition, Shane?
No, not whatsoever. But we need more. We haven't even touched the tip of the iceberg of local food production systems. And then we need people out here like Brian and yourself and Alan and many here on this panel who are out here producing, foods in a regenerative way, building nutrient density back within our product, expressing these flavonoids. And as Brian said, you can taste it in your food when you start getting healthy systems back.
Brian, you're not worried about competition, are you?
No, sir, not at all.
You'd be doing this webinar if you were.
Just looking at some overall national numbers, the population, 330 million and growing, while the population of farmers is decreasing. I mean, we're already less than 1.25%. There's not enough of us as it is, much less enough of us doing regenerative direct marketing practices. I'm not worried at all, and I welcome the challenge of competition because it's going to make me work harder to outperform the competition.
Very good. Alan, we have a grazing question for you. Looking for ideas on animal impact for small acreage. For example, we have 2 acres of pasture and about half of an acre in garden. How do we implement animal impact?
Well, with small acreage, you really want to think small species. You can, with just a couple of acres, really that's one cow, and you're not going to get much of an impact with that. So when you think small species, we're thinking small ruminants and poultry. You would be amazed at the very powerful impact that poultry can have. So broilers, laying hens, even ducks, geese, those types of things can have a very powerful and positive impact. And even mixing those species, having some broilers, having some laying hens can be highly effective on small acreage, or mixing in some small ruminants like goats and sheep, or pastured pigs as well into that mix. So you have a multiplicity of options, but if you've got small acreage, then I would go again with the smaller species and not even consider the larger species like cattle.
Thank you, Alan. David asks, and I'm going to start with Shane and then go to Brian. I have not seen the sawdust under the feed stations until now. Does it function like cat litter? What's the end result of sawdust soaking all of that up? What do you do with it? Shane, I know you use that on your operation.
Absolutely. You can utilize it as a compost if you like. I mean, as a soil amendment. I mean, basically, yes, it's functioning the same as the cat litter. I mean, it's capturing those soluble nutrients, hold them in place. It's a great carbon source for the microbiology, the sawdust. You're adding the manure to it and urine. It's full of biology, so you got a nitrogen and you got a carbon source, and it's a great soil amendment.
Brian?
Yes, sir. The reason why I choose sawdust is because it's free and I've got a bunch of it. It's on my operation from the sawmill, and I know it works. When I put it under the cow, I know the sawdust is A, gonna absorb the urine, and B, absorb and collect the manure, compost the material, use appreciating infrastructure, the face of a hog, to turn it instead of diesel fuel, and then it is the fertility background of my farm. I use what I have. I try to keep it simple. The KISS method, keep it simple, stupid. I don't need to keep up with me personally. I don't try to keep up with more than I already have to. I'm stretched thin and I need it to be simple. Put the chips under the cows, let them compost, take them out, spread them, watch the plants grow. Done.
Shane, did you want to add something to that?
Well, what I appreciate with what Brian's doing is he's taking the waste stream from one enterprise and adding value to it to another enterprise. And it doesn't have to be, if you don't have wood chips, I mean, there's all kinds of carbon sources that you can find, locate. Cardboard, like Doug talked about. You use it as bedding. You can use mulch or hay, straw, whatever. Find the waste stream from one enterprise and learn how to add value to another.
Thank you, Shane. And this next question from Clyde kind of ties in with that. I have a cover crop this year. How do I plant the vegetables without losing them in the cover crop? I have no livestock. Do I use weed block, wood chips, or mow it? Brian?
I would like to pose this question. When are you gonna be planting? At what stage are you gonna be waiting to plant? Warm season, cool season? There's many ways to terminate a cover. Take a 4-foot piece of 2x4, drill a hole in each end, run a rope through one end, tie a knot, run a rope through the other end, tie a knot, and you've got a trampling board that can lay that mature cover over. If you've got children, tell them to go play in the garden. Any kind of impact that can damage that plant. we'll terminate it if it's in the right stage.
Right. Okay, Alan. Gabe Brown has no experience at this next question, so I'm calling on you since you're from the south. The question is, I have fire ants in a couple fields that I want to implement diversity with spring and summer cover crops. Should I apply broadcast insecticide bait, which may hurt good insects and microbes, or will the regeneration possibly limit the spread of the fire ants?
Okay, excellent question. And yes, I'm intimately familiar with fire ants. So, no, do not apply broadcast insecticide. First of all, it's not really going to take care of your problem. And as you state in your question, it's going to hurt a lot of your beneficial insects and your microbes. So what we have found is that you simply outcompete them. And the very best way to outcompete them is to implement practices and diversity in the plants that you're growing so that you have a lot more biomass growing there. That biomass constantly disturbs the mounds that they build, and they do not like those mounds to be continually disturbed. So they'll actually move off of you onto the fringes of your property on a neighbor's property. And that's exactly what we have seen. Our neighbors now have all of our fire ants. So we're thankful for our neighbors that they welcomed our fire ants. But in good grazing is critically important. If you graze too close continuously, fire ants absolutely love that. You've created great habitat. So always leave plenty of residue, and the fire ants will again move off of you.
Thank you, Alan. So David, here's a question from Kyle. Is soil armor classified solely as carbon?
Well, there's a lot in it other than just carbon. There's a lot of different nutrients when you're looking at it. A lot of times we talk about managing your carbon to nitrogen ratio. So when we're looking at that residue for our next cash crop, we want to have that residue break down either really quickly and enough so we're not tying up nutrients for, let's say, a corn, or do we want a residue to be sitting there longer on that soil profile to help protect it, keep it cooler, suppress out weeds, and in front of like a legume type species or cucurbits or something like that. But there's also a lot of potassium, phosphorus, calcium, iron, zinc, manganese, boron, magnesium. It's full of all of those nutrients. And, depending on the plant and plant species and the mixes, you can get basically a compost tea effect out of those crop residues. Every time it rains and they're sitting on the soil surface, it's leaching out those nutrients into that soil for that next plant that's growing there to be taken up. So it's a great thing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, David. Next question. Is there a specific resource that lists which vegetables are best to plant together? Well, one of them, a book that's out there is Carrots Love Tomatoes. That's one of them that's out there. Do any of you know of any other resource materials on that subject?
If you just
go ahead, David.
If you just Google garden plant companion crops, it's going to come up with a huge list of plants that can be planted with each other.
Okay. Thank you, David. Brian, Jessica asked, when do you interseed the squash into the buckwheat?
When do you interseed squash into buckwheat?
Yep.
I'm interseeding buckwheat into squash.
Okay.
My squash is the cash crop, or the crop that I'm wanting to focus on. The buckwheat is simply to provide some soil structure in between the rows until the plants can bush and canopy and fill in. I don't care if it chokes out the buckwheat. I think it was David Brandt that said 20 pounds of buckwheat can cycle 35 or 40 pounds of phosphorus in just a matter of a few days in one flowering season. Well, those are nutrients that will be there in carbonaceous form for, like David just said, for my next crop. So while I'm growing one crop, I'm preparing the nutrient bed for the next. And when do I plant as far as timing? I'll let the squash be 2-3 weeks old, because the buckwheat will outgrow the squash if started too early. So what I try to do is let the desired crop get established and let it do its thing and be growing, and then seed the next.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, Shane, Linda from northern Montana. Heavy soils, high in pH, just like we described on the earlier question. She is flood irrigating, and so those fields are being inundated with water for about a week each spring. Her question is, what does this irrigation do to soil biology?
Well, if you don't have any aggregation in your soil, it's going to make it very, very anaerobic. You know, from the description I've read here, you know, she probably has some pretty anaerobic soils to begin with. The water on top is going to continue that process. You know, what I encourage you to do is try to get, you know, keep a living root there in the soil and get, you know, start building that armor and allow that microbiology to start building that soil aggregation, you know, and, you know, maybe look at some more higher lignified plants, because the biggest thing you're probably going to need is a fungal component, I'm assuming. And the fungal is what helps build the macro aggregates. So, you know, that's the approach I would start taking. I would encourage her probably to also look at pulling a Haney soils test and a phospholipid fatty acid test to kind of see what you got going on, you know, within that soil structure.
Thank you, Shane. Doug Peterson, Cassandra asks, trace minerals for livestock. Do you prefer individual minerals to be separate so you can see what they are consuming, or do you use a combination mineral lick?
All right, Gabe, that's a great question. That's one that I've probably struggled with as much as anybody. You know, I do believe without a doubt, if you read any of Fred Provenza's work out of Utah State, I do believe without a doubt that animals have the ability to select individual minerals. And we have done that for several years. We have used a free choice mineral program. And I've also done, you know, bags of mineral that were mixed, a combination mineral lick, as she says. Ultimately, I think if you have a very diverse mixture in your pasture and you're managing your pasture really well, they will get the majority of the minerals they need from those forages. I do realize there's different parts of the country, the South, where the soils are more leached than in other areas. But if you have a very diverse mixture and manage it very well, you know, tall residuals so that the plants can go down into that soil profile and pull up those minerals that they need, they will transfer those on to the cows. You know, most people probably are still gonna offer mineral to their cattle. So at that point, then it kind of gets back to your context, what you have time for. Honestly, I believe in the free choice mineral program, and we did it. I just didn't have time to haul out 16 different bags. So we don't do that right now. But honestly, you know, different times of the year, when I have a set of cows on a very diverse mixture that I have, diverse native mixture, they really don't use hardly any mineral. So I think your pasture management is going to dictate your mineral consumption much more than people would ever believe.
Thank you, Doug. Here we've got another grazing question, and I'll start with David and then have Alan follow up, please. Paul said he gave us a compliment on the Regen Ag 101 course. Thank you, Paul. He would like some more info on cattle integrating into crops before and after a corn, soybean, wheat rotation. Which cover crops would work with these crops and cattle integration? Now, I am not sure where Paul is from, but judging from the rotation, David, you should be familiar with that one. Alan, do you want to take over?
Sorry, I was muted.
Okay.
So obviously after the wheat, instead of, depending on where you are, instead of planting a greedy bean, as I like to call them, a double crop soybean, you go in there with some, some type of a millet or forage sorghum, sorghum Sudan grass, and you could do a mix with some cowpeas, mung beans, sunflowers, buckwheat. There's a lot of opportunity there to grow a lot of different forages there to be consumed by the livestock. Depending on what the next cash crop is, we'd have to be cognizant on making sure that we're developing blends that, if we are wanting to put in, a cool season after that warm season mix, that we're using species that aren't allelopathic to our cool seasons. Then, after soybeans, we really probably need to watch our, when we're planting our cash crops in the spring and what maturities we're using, so we can, get the right cover crop established for that next cash crop. But then if we're using, like, if we're planting early soybeans with an early maturing variety, then we can harvest earlier. That'll give us more of an opportunity to put in some, spring triticale, spring barley, spring oats into a mix of, cereal rye, or winter triticale or anything like that. Those spring species will actually get more vegetative growth in the fall and can provide much more grazing opportunity. Again, you can mix in the clovers, the vetches, the turnips, kale. Kale's really good. I love using kale for grazing. But there's a lot of different options we can do there.
Alan, would you care to add anything?
Yeah, first of all, I agree with what David said, and just a couple of other things. If you're when you plant your corn, you could consider an interseeding. So you could look at potentially going to 40-inch rows and interseeding at the V2 to V4 stage, so that you get a cover crop going and you have grazing very shortly after you take that corn off. We've been able to help a lot of clients in many regions of the country do this successfully. So that is certainly something to consider with your wheat rotation. Considering the time that most wheat comes off, you still got quite a bit of time to plant warm season annuals into that ground and get some really good grazing there before the end of the summer and into the fall, or even stockpile a portion of that for winter grazing. Another consideration besides the ones that David mentioned are the fact that you will definitely need to pay attention to the herbicides that you are using, because certain herbicides are going to have residue issues that could impact the cover crop mix, the specific mix that you plant, and inhibit germination and growth. Also, certain herbicides have grazing restrictions as well. So do pay attention to that. And there's some excellent resources there on the, you can get those resources from Penn State University, University of Wisconsin, and even Iowa State University. So just Google herbicide restrictions and cover crops at any of those universities, and you'll find some excellent information. And Green Cover Seed also has some good information and links about that as well. So you can go to greencoverseed.com to find out more about restrictions.
Thank you, Alan. You know, Ray Archuleta, I did not see that you were on this call until I had to hit an arrow. So your question is coming up after this one for Brian. So Brian, this person asks, I have started gardens by tilling it all up and mixing in compost. Without tilling, what is the best way to start the soil in the garden where the soil is rock hard and crumbles when you break it apart? Where does she start?
Where do you start? That's a great question. I was faced with this very same issue. The soil that the soil that we'll say I inherited, had been heavy tillage, no diversity, mostly deer corn. So very limited diversity. It was very compact. It would slake, it would erode. The first thing that I done was put a diverse mix on it. Got a living root in the ground with some diversity, trying to build some aggregation so that I could get some loosening of the soil surface, attract some biology, and stimulate that soil to start to heal. 6 years later, that soil is now synthetic free. I can plant whatever I want to, and with just a touch of compost, I've got a crop in 60 days. It's almost like I've got a magic button. But I started with the soil health principles. Let nature handle the issues that you stress about, because it's not an issue to nature. Get out of the way. I had to do the very same thing. Just step out of the way, use the principles, and let what nature already knows how to do happen. You don't have to do anything extra. Just use your eyes and your mind and get out of your mind's way to solve the very issue that you're facing. That's what I had to do.
Yeah, that's very good advice, Brian. Follow the principles. And Rachel asked about that same thing in Alaska. All I would say is just reiterate what Brian said. It's all about following the principles, however, in your context. Obviously, Alaska, much shorter growing season, so you're going to have to adjust the species of plants that you use. Okay, Ray, I saved a good one here for you. This person tells us that they are from India, where they grow coffee, which is a perennial. Due to the nature of our topography, which is hilly, we grow perennial native shade trees to protect the coffee plants from high temperatures. They like regenerative agriculture, and their question is, what type of cover crops would you suggest for my environment? Oh, don't tell me Ray isn't on there. Okay. David, Doug, Shane, anyone want to take a swing at that one?
That's a tough one, really.
They've got us all stumped here.
Yeah, you know, I was just thinking about it though. Let me think, what book was it I was just listening to? One of David Montgomery's Growing a Revolution. He actually talks about somebody that was using cover crops in with coffee. I can't remember where it was, but
I think that was probably Kofi Boa in Ghana.
it might have been, yeah. Yeah. So, you know, there's probably options out there. I just don't know.
Yeah, they stumped us. We'll have to work on that one. Shane, did you have anything to add?
Well, Egyptian wheat. I mean, that sorghum sudan plant, you know, you got to worry about breaking over if you have a lot of wind and stuff, but it does get, you know, some extremely tall vertical height. You know, there are certain plants out there that could probably incorporate into that system. You know, you just have to do some research looking for those.
Okay, thank you, Shane. I would suggest also that you look at your native plants that are in the area. So often we overlook native species as cover crops. They're actually excellent cover crops. Okay, guys, anyone can take this one. Would it not be acceptable when converting a couple of acres of existing grazed pasture to vegetable production to initially till the soil, use plastic to suppress weeds, and address the seed bank issue? Then remove the plastic, establish 30-inch production rows, broad forked, and then cover with cardboard, top dress with compost and appropriate organic amendments to start production. Subsequent culture would not include any tillage other than broad fork aeration if needed, and focus on developing improved soil health as a priority. Shane, I know you're chomping at the bit over that one.
I was hoping you were going to call on David first.
What does the tillage do, Shane?
Okay, let's talk about that real quick. You know, first thing is you start the tillage process. You know, you're gonna get this large flush of our strategist bacteria, and what they're going to do is they're going to consume a lot of the carbon within your soil, and before you know it, you're going to have this very collapsed structure in your soil. Because you know, think of the microbiology. You know, when you allow a large flush of oxygen into the system, you know, they're going to reproduce. And through that reproduction process, they're going to consume a lot of nitrogen, a lot of carbon. And that's what's going to create your very platy structure in your soils. You know, so, you know, talking about what like we have tonight, you know, get some cover on top of that soil, you know, look at other methods. I like what Doug was talking about, utilizing cardboard. You know, there's some other great means to, you know, suppress, manage for what you want, and don't manage for what you don't want. I'll let Doug elaborate a little more on that because I know he can.
Yeah, Shane, I mean, I understand that we've got to figure out a way to terminate the perennial grass. But when you go in and do the tillage, in addition to all the things that Shane said, all those pore spaces that connect the surface down through that soil profile, any tillage you do is going to chop all those pore spaces up. You're going to, even if you didn't burn any carbon, even if you didn't stimulate that bacteria, just the chopping is going to break all those pore spaces. So, you know, if you want to kill it, in that whole description there of what they mentioned, just eliminate the tillage right off the bat and use the plastic to suppress the weeds and take out the seed bank, and then go on with that process. Just eliminate that initial tillage and head right on down the road is what I would do. We just do not understand. Tillage is ingrained into us as a human society, and we just do not understand the damage that tillage does to that soil system.
Yeah, I would just add to that. You're exactly right, Doug. What we typically see, no matter what you do, 10 years later, you'll still see that zone where you tilled. It lasts that long, about no matter what you do. So Larry, I see Alan answered your question. Yes, this recording will be available. Here's a question, and Alan, I'm going to shoot it to you. What kind of cattle do you think would be best in the Philippines?
Okay, so I was actually typing an answer to that one as you ask it, Gabe, but I will answer it live here. So in any environment, the first thing that you want to do is you want to look at breeds that are highly adapted to your specific environment. So, you know, you're gonna be dealing with a subtropical type environment. Therefore, you want cattle breeds that are going to fit that type of environment and that are going to be hardy. Now, there's obviously Zebu breeds that will work in that regard, Bos Indicus, but there's also quite a few Bos Taurus breeds. There's a number of breeds from Africa that could work very well there. There's a number of breeds in Asia that could work well. So what you're going to want to do is, rather than thinking about trying to go out and find that specific breed and then import it, you want to look at the cattle that are already readily available in your region, in your territory, and that have already proven themselves to be highly adapted. They're familiar with the type of plants, your forages that are growing there, and they're already adapted to your environment, your climate. So that's the first place that I would look, is who are the breeders, who are the people that have cattle that have already proven themselves, and start there. And then using your own selection, you can make those animals even better.
Thank you, Alan. As long as you're unmuted. Karen asks, what age are you harvesting cattle for optimal yield and quality?
So I'm assuming that question is referring to grass finished cattle. So I'm going to answer it relative to that. And if you have the right genotype and phenotype cattle, and when I say that, the cattle that we have found to work over and over again, regardless of where you're located in North America, are cattle that are going to be around that 4-frame category. And so if we've got nice, deep, thick 4-frame type cattle, and you're doing a really good job of building soil health, you've got plant species diversity, you're using high levels of adaptive grazing, then you should anticipate those cattle being ready for harvest somewhere between 22 and 26 months of age on average. And if they are fully finished, and you've got to know what you're looking for there, but if they're fully finished and have that nice fat cover across all the body, a real nice smooth appearance from the shoulders all the way back through the hooks and the pins of the animal, then that's when you're going to have the best dressing percent. And typically they're going to dress 59 to 61% on average on a live weight to a dress weight basis.
Thank you, Alan. So the last question of the evening, I'm going to direct to Brian, since he did such a good job on the presentation. Mark tells us he has many dead elm trees and he's looking to run them through a chipper. How many pounds per acre would you spread of that chip material on your farm ground?
I'm going to answer it in the most direct, indirect way I possibly can. I don't know of the magic number of pounds. I know I have messed up before and over applied, as the carbon, if you apply too much carbon, it's gonna find nitrogen somewhere, and it's gonna draw it from the soil to balance, or to attempt to balance, the carbon to nitrogen ratio. Well, in a cropping system, if you pull nitrogen from the system, you're gonna in turn stress the plants. Yes, you're gonna break down this carbon, but you're stressing your plants as well. I usually, if I'm doing straight wood chips, take about the consistency of a 5-gallon bucket and just sling it. Just twirl in a circle and spin it. The wood chips are nowhere near touching each other, but yet there's enough there that you know you've done something. It's kind of that threshold of, you sort of learn what's too much and what's not enough. I personally prefer the wood chips that are a layer of wood chips that is not touching, and I'm gonna say maybe 4 to 8 inches between pieces, and
Yep.
then adjust using your observation on how that correlates to your next crop, either success or failure.
Yeah, Shane or Doug, David, any comments on carbon nitrogen ratios as pertains to that? Doug took his mute off first. Doug?
I've worked with one guy that spread wood chips, not in a thick layer, but probably quite a bit thicker than what Brian is talking about. It was not a solid layer. You could see the soil through it, but they were pretty thick. And as long as you come back the following year, maybe even 2 years with a soybean, for example, is what he planted. So it's not something that's relying on nitrogen. And it actually is very beneficial for those soybeans. It will make them nodulate more. So I wouldn't come back with corn though.
Yep. Shane?
No, Doug and Brian, both great points, and they pretty well hit the nail on the head. You just got to be cautious. Get too much carbon on the system, you're really going to mess up your carbon to nitrogen ratio and cause yourself issues.
Thank you, Shane. So just to make everybody aware, we have some more exciting webinars coming up. Just today, we heard an excellent presentation from Mike Bredesen. It's going to talk about the importance of insects and the ecosystem and the work they're doing. Really a good presentation, and we're working on Mike to get him to do a webinar for us. We have several others in the works, so please tune in, check out the Understanding Ag and Soil Health Academy websites. Brian, thank you very much for the presentation this evening. We certainly enjoyed it. Thanks to all of you for listening in. On behalf of the teams of Understanding Ag and Soil Health Academy, we thank you and be safe. Good night, everyone.